Pierre was a black man from humble origins, born in a small village on the outskirts of Lyon. His childhood was marked by challenges. At the age of 20, Pierre began working as a mechanic in a small workshop. He had been passionate about cars since his childhood, fascinated by the roar of engines and the sleek design of vehicles. However, working for others was never enough for him. He had a burning desire to create something of his own, something that would carry his identity. It was with this vision that, years later, he opened his first car dealership, saving every penny. If you're new here, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to help me bring new stories for you. It was a small shop located in a more affordable neighborhood in Lyon, where the rent was cheaper. There, Pierre sold popular cars like the Renault Clio, Peugeot 208, and Volkswagen Golf. The initial stock was modest, with only 5 cars parked in a small yard. Pierre did everything. He was the salesman, the manager, the mechanic, and even responsible for cleaning. He knew his clients by name, listened to their stories, and made sure to offer exceptional service, something that quickly began to set him apart in the market. However, the path was not easy. Pierre faced silent prejudice, suspicious looks, and even direct comments suggesting that such a business was not meant for someone like him. But he didn't let it get him down. Every sale was a small victory. Every satisfied customer was one step closer to climbing the ladder he was determined to climb. 4 years later, things began to change. Pierre's unwavering dedication began to pay off. His shop gained a reputation due to its honesty, the quality of the cars, and above all, the charisma of its owner. He accumulated significant profits and gradually expanded the business. From a small yard, he moved to a larger showroom, offering more space for the vehicles. The stock, which had once been limited to basic models, began to include more sophisticated brands like Audi and BMW. Pierre didn't just sell cars, he sold dreams. He understood that for many people, buying a car was a great achievement, and he enthusiastically became a part of that journey with genuine interest. His passion for business and his ability to build solid relationships were the foundation of his success. But Pierre didn't want to just do what everyone else was doing. He had bigger ambitions. Inspired by the displays of luxury car dealerships he saw in magazines, he decided it was time for a big leap. He would transform his shop into an exclusive space for luxury and high-performance cars. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bugattis, cars that didn't just drive on the streets but made hearts race. It was a risky market, but Pierre believed the risk was worth it. With millions of euros accumulated in profits and a respected name in the market, Pierre made the transition. He invested heavily, renovated the showroom, and began attending luxury car trade shows to connect with suppliers and attract high-end clients. His shop became a landmark in Lyon, a space where every detail, from the lighting to the air, conveyed exclusivity and sophistication. Gauthier became Pierre's right-hand man from the beginning. When the showroom was small and the profits modest, he was there selling cars, cleaning the yard, and sometimes even helping with vehicle maintenance. He seemed to share Pierre's enthusiasm and was always talking about how he would transform the business into a success. Pierre trusted him. After all, Gauthier had always been there, wearing the company's shirt, offering ideas to improve sales and building close relationships with the customers. Over the years, Gauthier saw the business grow impressively. He had been by Pierre's side when the small yard turned into a modern showroom and when popular cars were replaced by luxury machines. He closely followed every step of the business's transformation. But over time, something changed in Gauthier. The loyalty that had once seemed sincere began to give way to a feeling Gauthier tried unsuccessfully to hide. From the outside, Gauthier remained the reliable, effective manager. He continued to do his job well, was courteous with clients, and maintained the facade of loyalty. But inside, envy began to grow like a weed. He looked at Pierre and no longer saw the boss who inspired him, but the man who had become everything Gauthier dreamed of being. Gauthier couldn't accept that Pierre's success was so great, while he remained in a subordinate position. The thought started almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just a small discomfort. How could Pierre have so much while I have so little? But it grew, and soon it became an incessant voice in his head. He didn't understand how Pierre, a black man from humble beginnings, could have accumulated millions so quickly, while Gautier, a white man with more privilege, remained just an employee. For Gautier, the shop was a constant reminder of his own failure. He saw Pierre transform, the simple man who, at first, wore ordinary clothes and a cheap watch, now strutted around in a perfectly tailored suit, drove cars that cost more than some homes, and was respected by everyone in the automotive industry. Meanwhile, Gautier continued to live in a small apartment, struggling to pay his bills with the same salary he had received for years. This disparity became unbearable. Gautier began to see Pierre's success as something unfair. He spent hours rethinking all the moments he had sacrificed his time for the business, every night spent organizing documents, every time he canceled personal commitments to meet the company's needs. In his warped mind, Gautier began to believe that Pierre's success was only possible because of him. Gautier, whose mind was now poisoned by envy, began to create stories to justify Pierre's success. He wondered, had he really earned everything honestly? When he saw Pierre sell a Bugatti Veyron for 2 million euros in cash, his indignation reached its peak. Who carries that kind of money? It must be money laundering or some illegal activity, he thought. This unfounded suspicion fueled the fire of his resentment. From then on, Gautier began to observe Pierre from a different angle. Every decision Pierre made, every gesture, every victory seemed to be an affront to his own position. He wanted to believe that Pierre wasn't as honest as he appeared. It was easier to think that way than to admit that Gautier might not have the same ability, vision, or determination. Despite all of this, Gautier continued to play his role. He still completed his tasks and kept a smile on his face. But deep down, the distance between him and Pierre grew. Pierre, on the other hand, didn't notice the cracks in their relationship. To him, Gautier remained the same loyal manager he had always been, someone he could trust with his eyes closed. But the relationship, once built on mutual respect and camaraderie, was now irreparably compromised. Gautier no longer saw Pierre as a leader, but as an obstacle, someone he needed to overthrow in order to finally occupy the position he believed he deserved by right. What Pierre didn't know was that the man he trusted most was becoming his biggest threat. While Pierre celebrated his successes and expanded his horizons, Gautier harbored a dark resentment that would soon burst into a calculated plan of betrayal. Behind his calm demeanor and smile, there was now a heart consumed by envy and a sense of injustice. He blindly believed that it was only a matter of time before Pierre would pay for his arrogant success. And when that moment came, Gautier would make sure he was the one to bring Pierre down. The loyal manager was about to reveal his true face. Envy is like a timid flame that, when fed, can turn into an uncontrollable blaze. For Gautier, Pierre's loyal manager, this feeling began almost imperceptibly. Gautier began to wonder how Pierre, a black man from humble origins, had accomplished so much in such a short time. He himself was white, with a reasonable education and experience in the industry, but had been stuck in the same position for years, with no growth prospects. The idea that Pierre had broken all the barriers and reached a position of prestige seemed like a personal offense to Gautier. This question became an obsession. Gautier began to watch every move Pierre made with a critical eye, looking for faults, something that could devalue his success. But Pierre was disciplined, meticulous, and above all, honest. He left no room for obvious mistakes. This only fueled Gautier's frustration, who began to think that there might be something hidden, a dark truth behind all of Pierre's shine. The spark of envy grew stronger when Gautier witnessed something that seemed incomprehensible to him. Pierre negotiating the sale of a Bugatti Veyron for 2 million euros in cash. The money, packed in luxurious leather suitcases, was being inspected in the showroom, while Pierre, with the confidence of someone who had everything under control, led the negotiation. Gautier, hidden behind one of the showroom pillars, watched the scene with his heart pounding and his thoughts bubbling. Who does business like this? He wondered. To Gautier, this could only mean one thing. Pierre was involved in something illegal, maybe stolen cars, money laundering, or even tax evasion. He had no proof, but his mind was already building a narrative that justified Pierre's success as something illegal. Though this thought was completely unfounded, it brought relief to Gautier. It was easier to believe that Pierre was dishonest than to face the possibility that Gautier simply didn't have the same talent, vision, or determination. It was more comfortable to create a story in which Pierre didn't deserve what he had, because it removed the responsibility from Gautier for his own stagnation. As the days passed, Gautier began to avoid Pierre. He answered in monosyllables, avoided looking his boss in the eye, and whenever possible, he left before they had time to talk. But Pierre, busy with expanding the business and new projects, didn't notice the change in his manager's behavior. He continued to trust him as always, unaware that behind the scenes, their relationship was deteriorating. For Gautier, every day spent in the shop was a painful reminder of his failure. He saw Pierre arrive in cars that cost more than his entire house, talking on the phone about investments and travel. He saw wealthy clients enter the shop and treat him with respect and admiration, and what was most cruel for Gautier was seeing Pierre's smile, a smile from someone who seemed to have succeeded in life. In the evening, Gautier would return to his small apartment where the walls seemed to suffocate him. He would sit on the couch, staring at the ceiling while the anger boiled inside him. It's not fair, he thought. I've been here from the beginning. I helped grow this business with him. If it weren't for me, he wouldn't have reached this level. This thought began to shape Gautier's perspective. He convinced himself that he deserved more money, more recognition, more power. And instead of talking to Pierre or looking for legitimate ways to advance, he chose the path of self-pity and quiet conspiracy. The seed of envy had turned into a poisonous plant, and Gautier was about to feed it with concrete actions. Deep down, Gautier knew he was at a crossroads. He could either continue following Pierre, accept his role as a subordinate, and hope one day he would be rewarded, or he could take control of the situation, even if it meant betraying the man who had believed in him the most. The choice seemed clear to Gautier. He decided that if Pierre had built his fortune with his help, then it was only right for him to destroy it all and take what he thought was his by right. After all, in his warped mind, Pierre was not the hero of the story. He was the usurper, someone who had what Gautier believed belonged to him. One Friday, Gautier was behind the counter organizing documents while Pierre, as usual, circulated around the space with the confident posture of a man who knew exactly where he wanted to go. Despite the professional atmosphere, the climate between the two was no longer the same. Gautier had become a master at hiding his growing dissatisfaction, but inside, he was ready to take action. He felt like a volcano about to erupt at the end of the day when the last clients had left and silence began to settle in the showroom. Pierre called Gautier for a conversation. The tone wasn't friendly, but it wasn't aggressive either. It was firm, authoritative, as if Pierre was testing the limits of his authority. Gautier, before you leave, I need you to wash my cars. They're dirty, and I want them spotless by tomorrow morning. The sentence cut through the air like a sharp blade. Gautier froze, staring at Pierre for a few seconds, trying to process what he had just heard. Washing the cars? Him, the store manager, being treated like a simple maintenance worker? That was how Pierre saw his value. Sorry, but that's not part of my duties, Gautier responded, trying to keep a calm tone, though indignation seeped through every word. Pierre, hands in his pockets and head slightly tilted, gave him a look combining coldness and impatience. I'm not asking you, Gautier, I'm ordering you, and if that's a problem for you, maybe you should reconsider your position here. The words hit like a gunshot. Gautier felt his face flush, his pride crushed by Pierre's unyielding posture. He wanted to shout, to say everything he was feeling, but he knew that any impulsive reaction could cost him his job. And although he hated admitting it, he needed the salary. Resigned, Gautier grabbed the keys and headed for the parking lot. The night had already fallen, and the temperature was low. The wind bit at his face as he filled a bucket with water and took a sponge. Pierre's cars were lined up, shining under the parking lot lights like a parade of wealth he would never have. Lamborghini, Aston Martin, Ferrari, each car seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder that he was meant to serve, never to own. As he washed the first car, Gautier felt the resentment grow. Every movement of the sponge against the bodywork seemed to carry his frustration. Every drop of water falling was like his pride being washed away. He looked at his watch. It was already past 10 p.m. Pierre was probably at home, relaxing, while Gautier scrubbed wheels and cleaned windows. When he was done, it was almost 11 p.m. His hands were frozen, his body exhausted. But what hurt the most was the feeling of humiliation that flooded his soul. Climbing into his car to head home, he couldn't contain the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. How hostile. I built this store with him. If it weren't for me, Pierre wouldn't have reached this level, and now he treats me like just another employee, like I'm disposable. As he drove through the deserted streets of Lyon, Gautier felt his anger turn into something deeper. It was no longer just resentment, it was a desire for revenge. He wanted Pierre to pay for every humiliation, every order, every superior look. It wasn't just about washing cars, it was everything that it symbolized. Pierre had made it clear that to him, Gautier would never be more than an employee, someone he could cast aside at any moment. That night, when Gautier arrived home, he sat in the darkness of his small apartment, staring into the void. The humiliation from the parking lot still echoed in his mind. But now something else was taking shape. An idea, dark and dangerous, began to sprout. He didn't know exactly how, but he was determined. Pierre would pay for treating him this way. He would pay dearly. While the silence of the night enveloped the apartment, Gautier swore to himself. No matter the cost, he would find a way to take down Pierre, to destroy the empire he had built. And when that moment came, Gautier would make sure Pierre felt the same pain, the same humiliation that he had felt that night. He began to mentally revisit all the vulnerable points of the business. Pierre trusted him to handle the paperwork, finances, and transactions. It was Gautier who organized the documents, supervised the vehicle contracts and warranties, and even managed tax payments. That blind trust would be his weapon. He knew the only way to get to Pierre was to turn that trust into his greatest weakness. The plan started to form in his mind. He would falsify the store's documents, creating the illusion that Pierre was involved in illegal activities. It wasn't difficult to do. The store dealt with large sums of money, often in cash, especially during the sale of luxury cars. It was the perfect environment to sow doubt. Gautier would use this to create a web of lies convincing enough to attract the authorities' attention. He would spend nights accessing the office, altering financial records, falsifying figures and signatures. Everything had to look legitimate enough that Pierre wouldn't notice until it was too late. Gautier didn't just want to hurt Pierre, he wanted to ruin his reputation, destroy his life. He wanted Pierre's name to be associated with the word criminal. Anger drove him as he mentally outlined each step of the plan. For weeks, he would sneak into the store late at night to access the files. He knew the camera system, knew when the showroom was empty, and which areas were not covered by the cameras. It wouldn't be hard to act without being seen. After forging the evidence, Gautier would make an anonymous tip to the police. That would be the most delicate part of the plan. He had to make it seem convincing, like someone who had actually witnessed illegal activity. Pierre buys stolen cars and launders money, he would say. He manipulates documents to avoid taxes. The tip would be made at a strategic time, during a major negotiation when Pierre would be most exposed and vulnerable. But Gauthier wouldn't stop there. He knew the police wouldn't act quickly without concrete proof. To make sure the investigation would start immediately, he would elaborate on the story with meticulous details, providing falsified documents as evidence. He knew the store's records like the back of his hand and knew which cars had been sold and which could easily be manipulated to seem part of an illicit scheme. That night, sitting in his kitchen, Gauthier felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. The fear came from knowing that if something went wrong, he could get caught. But the excitement was stronger, fueled by the desire to see Pierre fall. He imagined the day when the police would raid the store, handcuff him in front of everyone, and take him away like an ordinary criminal. That was the image that kept him going. Gauthier's resentment wasn't just professional. It was personal. He didn't see Pierre just as a boss who had humiliated him, but as a symbol of everything he could never be. Pierre was living proof that success didn't automatically come to those who considered themselves superior. For Gauthier, destroying Pierre wasn't just about revenge. It was an act of self-affirmation. It was a cry to show that he too could manipulate his destiny to his advantage. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, Gauthier made his final decision. He wouldn't back down. There was no room for doubt or regret. Pierre had crossed the line, and Gauthier, in his twisted mind, believed he was delivering justice. The plan was set, and he was going to put everything into motion. The days passed, and soon enough, the screeching sound of tires attracted everyone's attention in the store. Police vehicles arrived at high speed, slamming to a stop in front of the showroom. Armed men in uniform got out of the cars, some carrying documents, others wielding weapons. The tension in the air was palpable. Pierre, who was in his office reviewing contracts, heard the sound of the doors being violently thrown open and hurried footsteps. He quickly rushed outside to see what was going on. Before he could react, the police barged in, kicking the doors open with force. The shards of glass scattered across the floor, creating a brutal contrast with the luxury of the space. Pierre took a few hesitant steps, confusion on his face. He raised his hands instinctively, trying to show that he posed no threat. "What's going on here?" he asked in a firm voice, but with an incredulous tone. One of the officers, without answering, grabbed him by the arm and threw him violently to the ground. The sound of the impact was sharp, his body hitting the floor with a harsh thud that echoed in the previously silent space. Pierre tried to get up, but he was pushed back to the ground again. The clients and employees stood frozen, watching the scene in shock. The man who had once been a figure of authority and inspiration was now being treated like an ordinary criminal. "You are under arrest for involvement in the purchase of stolen cars and tax evasion," announced one officer as others began searching the showroom. Pierre tried to protest, but his words got stuck in his throat. He couldn't understand what was happening. He knew his management was flawless, that his store operated within the rules. "This is a mistake," he thought, as the handcuffs tightened around his wrists. He was dragged out of the showroom. The indignation of the scene was amplified by the presence of curious onlookers who began gathering outside. The man he had seen as a symbol of success and resilience was now thrown into the back of a police car like a trophy of the law. As the car pulled away, Pierre cast one last glance at his showroom, the place he had built with so much effort. Every detail, every decision, every aspect of it was now being ransacked, observed by the curious eyes of the public and the force of the police. Sitting in the police car, his heart racing and his mind spinning for answers, he could think of only the security cameras installed at Pierre's request to guarantee the safety of the luxury vehicles recorded all movements inside the store. Serge was convinced that the answer was there. As he headed towards the store's central computer, he felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He connected a portable device to access the recording system and began looking for footage from the days leading up to Pierre's arrest. The process was slow, with every click on the keyboard echoing in the oppressive silence of the place. But as the files loaded, Serge noticed something that made him freeze. The recordings for the entire month were missing. Serge blinked, incredulous, and tried again. He searched for any evidence, any fragment of video that might have been overlooked. Nothing. The files had been deleted with meticulous precision, as if someone knew exactly what they were doing. He took a deep breath, trying to control his disappointment. This was a tough blow. Without those images, how could he prove that Pierre wasn't responsible for the irregularities? Sitting in the office chair, Serge let his gaze wander across the room. It was an environment that reflected Pierre's organization and success, but now it felt like a battlefield, with signs of struggle everywhere. He knew someone had planned this. The deletion of the recordings was no accident. It required privileged access, system knowledge, and most importantly, intent. That's when Serge began to think about possible suspects. He mentally revisited the list of people with access to the store's system. It wasn't a long list. Pierre was the main responsible, but there was also the manager, Gauthier. Serge had never suspected Gauthier before, but now, with the absence of the recordings, new questions arose. Gauthier had access to the system and knew how it worked, but why? What could his motivation be? Serge needed answers, and he needed them quickly. He decided to check the remote server, the one Pierre had mentioned during his visit to prison. The system was programmed to automatically send copies of the recordings to the cloud, an additional security layer that Pierre, ever cautious, had put in place in case the local files were compromised. Maybe the cloud still held the secrets Serge needed to uncover. He picked up his phone and called Pierre. "Pierre, the store recordings have been erased," he started directly. "It seems deliberate. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." On the other side of the line, Pierre was silent for a moment. Serge could hear his tense breathing. "But the cloud system, it makes automatic backups. Try accessing the cloud. The password is..." Pierre gave him the sequence, his voice laden with urgency and hope. Serge noted it down and immediately began attempting remote access. His heart raced as he entered the credentials, imagining what he would find. There was a moment of suspense as the system loaded, and then finally, the files started to appear on the screen. "I managed to access the cloud," Serge began, his voice a mix of relief and seriousness. "Pierre, we've found what we needed." Pierre leaned forward, his hands still cuffed, but his posture reflecting renewed anxiety. He could hardly believe that finally, something was going in his favor. "What did you find?" he asked in a near whisper, as if he feared everything might disappear again. Serge took a deep breath before responding. "The recordings. They show Gauthier entering the office at suspicious times. He was filmed handling documents, and it wasn't just once. He did it 4 different nights, Pierre, and each time, he left with something in his hands and came back the next day, probably with forged documents." Serge's words hit Pierre like a combination of relief and anger. Relief that he finally had proof of his innocence, anger at the betrayal of someone he had trusted like a brother. Pierre felt warmth flood his body as he thought about Gauthier, the man he had promoted and often treated like a family member. "Gauthier," Pierre whispered, the word leaving his mouth with difficulty. He had been planning this all along. Serge hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know if he planned everything from the start, but it's clear he saw an opportunity and decided to act. The important thing now is that we have evidence. The police won't be able to ignore this." Pierre nodded, but his gaze momentarily wandered, trying to remember all the times he had blindly trusted Gauthier, complimented him on his loyalty and dedication. How had he not seen the signs? Was there something he could have done differently? Guilt mixed with relief, creating an emotional storm that was hard to control. "The next step is to take this evidence to the police," Serge continued, interrupting Pierre's thoughts. "But be prepared, it might take time. Even with these recordings, we need to have them analyzed, Verified. Gautier might try to defend himself, especially now that he knows he's cornered. And if he tries to erase everything? Pierre asked, his concern evident. I've already taken precautions. I've made several copies and stored them in a safe place. Even if he tries something, there's no way to delete everything, Serge assured him. Pierre let out a deep sigh, feeling a bit of the pressure lift off his chest. He knew the fight wasn't over, but this small breakthrough was enough to reignite his determination. He looked at Serge, his eyes now shining with a mixture of gratitude and renewed strength. Serge, I need you to do one more thing for me, Pierre said, leaning forward slightly. I want Gautier's name to be destroyed as completely as he tried to destroy mine. I want him to feel what it's like to lose everything. The next few days after Serge handed over the recordings to the police, the tension in the air was palpable. Pierre waited in his cell, counting every second as if it were hours. He knew these images were his best chance, perhaps his only chance to prove his innocence. On the other side of the city, Serge closely followed the progress of the investigation. The investigators were carefully examining the recordings, trying to understand the full extent of what they had received. The footage was clear, detailed, and incriminating. It showed Gautier acting with precision, someone deeply familiar with the store. He was filmed entering the showroom late at night, scanning the area with caution before heading towards Pierre's office. His tense, calculated posture was that of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. In one of the recordings, Gautier was seen taking a pile of documents from Pierre's safe, an area only he and Pierre had access to. Then he left the store with the papers in hand. Days later, the cameras captured him returning early in the morning with the same documents now in a different folder. He put them back in the safe as if nothing had happened. The investigators didn't take long to realize his actions were highly suspicious. Gautier had no legitimate reason to access company documents outside business hours, and the frequency of his late-night visits indicated a deliberate intent to tamper with them. The recordings were irrefutable evidence that Gautier had fabricated the evidence that incriminated Pierre. As the police analyzed the footage, Serge presented a detailed report linking the images to the dates of the forged documents. He highlighted how the financial records and contracts had been altered at the same time Gautier had been filmed in the office. The connection was undeniable, and everything was beginning to fall into place. However, even with this evidence, Serge knew the case wasn't completely resolved. He needed to ensure the police acted swiftly before Gautier had a chance to escape or destroy more evidence. He pressed the authorities, stressing the gravity of the situation and the urgency of arresting Gautier before he could cause more harm. Meanwhile, Gautier seemed unaware that his betrayal was being exposed. He continued working in the store, still presenting the facade of a loyal and efficient manager. But something in his behavior began to shift. He noticed that Pierre was quieter than usual, as if he was waiting for something. And the police were becoming more frequent in their visits, asking subtle but pointed questions. Gautier felt the tension building, but he tried to remain calm. When Gautier realized the police were coming to arrest him, his mind went into chaos. He knew the recordings had been found, and everything he had done was about to be exposed. As the sound of the officer's heavy footsteps echoed through the store, Gautier felt his heart race with every beat, like a drum of war. He wasn't ready to face the truth. He couldn't be caught, not now. In a burst of adrenaline, Gautier ran toward the office where he knew a bottle of gasoline was stored, something he kept for emergencies involving the store's generator. He grabbed the container, his hands shaking, already thinking about what he would do if he were caught. He would destroy everything. Pierre might prove his innocence, but he wanted the price to be unbearably high. Without hesitation, Gautier ran through the showroom, pouring gasoline on the luxury cars that gleamed like trophies. Each vehicle represented Pierre's success, and Gautier wanted them all to disappear in flames. The strong smell of fuel filled the air, mixing with the sound of his hurried footsteps. The police, realizing what he was doing, began shouting, "Stop, Gautier!" One of them commanded firmly. But Gautier didn't stop. His movements were desperate, almost frantic as he poured gasoline on the cars, the leather seats, the glass tables, and the papers still scattered in the office. He knew he didn't have much time. Every second counted. He had to create chaos. When the last drop of gasoline was poured, Gautier took the metal lighter from his pocket. His hand was trembling so badly that he almost dropped it, but he managed to light it. For a moment, he hesitated, looking at the flames beginning to rise from the cars. It was too late to turn back now. But before Gautier could escape, he was surrounded by the police, who had already secured the building. They approached slowly, their weapons drawn. "Gautier, it's over," one of the officers said, his voice firm but steady. "We have everything we need." With Gautier's arrest, the trial began. The recordings played a central role in the prosecution's case against him. Pierre's name was cleared, and the evidence led to the full extent of Gautier's betrayal being revealed. The police uncovered the depth of the fraud that Gautier had orchestrated, how he had used his position to steal, falsify documents, and betray someone who had trusted him completely. The trial was long, but in the end, Gautier was convicted. His empire crumbled as the truth was exposed for everyone to see. Pierre's name was cleared, and the business began to recover. Serge stayed by his side throughout, unwavering in his loyalty. The friendship they had was tested by betrayal, but in the end, their bond was stronger than ever. And as Pierre stood in front of his business, now free of the shadow of Gautier's deception, he knew one thing: the truth had finally triumphed. As the evidence began to be presented, the security camera recordings were projected onto a giant screen so everyone could see them. The images of Gautier entering Pierre's office furtively, searching through documents and then tampering with them, were irrefutable. Every second of these videos seemed to weigh more heavily on Gautier's mind. He didn't look at the screen, preferring to stare at the floor, but the silence in the room said it all. There was no doubt about his guilt. In addition to the recordings, the experts confirmed that the modifications to the documents were recent and matched exactly the dates when Gautier had been filmed entering the office. The safe, which only Pierre and Gautier had access to, contained enough evidence to seal his fate. The prosecutor's speech was clear, direct, and powerful. Gautier had planned everything coldly, motivated by greed and resentment. When it was the defense's turn, Gautier's lawyer tried to justify his actions as a moment of weakness, an impulsive decision caused by years of accumulated frustration. He claimed that Gautier felt undervalued, that he believed he deserved more than he was receiving. But these words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Then it was Pierre's turn to speak. He stood up, walked to the center of the room, and stared at Gautier for a few seconds before turning to address the court. "For years I trusted this man. He wasn't just my manager. He was someone I believed in, someone I treated as a partner. I never thought he would turn against me like this, using my trust to try and destroy me. I lost my freedom, my reputation, my livelihood, all because he decided that what I had built with my own hands should belong to him. But today, I am here to say that he failed. I am standing, and I will rebuild my life, my store, and my dignity." Pierre's voice echoed through the room, filled with emotion and resolve. It was a speech that not only reaffirmed his innocence, but also showed his strength. When he finished, he returned to his seat, his head held high, as murmurs of approval filled the courtroom. When the moment of the verdict arrived, everyone held their breath. The judge, with a grave and impartial voice, read out the conclusions. Gautier was found guilty of all charges: fraud, document forgery, obstruction of justice, and arson. The evidence was clear, the intentions deliberate, and the damage irreparable. This court condemns Gautier to 17 years in prison, without the possibility of parole before serving at least 2/3 of the sentence. The words fell like an iron sentence on Gautier. He lowered his head, his shoulders slightly shaking as the reality hit him square in the face. His attempt to destroy Pierre had backfired devastatingly. He would now be remembered not as the man who tried to rise, but as the man who fell under the weight of his own greed. On the other side of the room, Pierre let out a long sigh. It wasn't exactly joy that he felt, but a sense of justice finally served. He knew there was still much to do to rebuild his life, but this moment marked a turning point, the end of a dark chapter. He looked at Serge and nodded, as if to say, "Let's move forward." As Gauthier was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed and dejected, Pierre stood up and exited through the main door, feeling the sun on his face for the first time in a long time. Outside, life went on, and he was ready to take it back, brick by brick, inch by inch, with the same determination he had always had. Pierre left the courthouse a free man, but the weight of his regained freedom was almost unbearable. Every step he took seemed laden with the memory of the months of injustice, Gauthier's betrayal, and the hell he had endured. Outside, the streets of Lyon seemed the same as before, but for Pierre, the world he knew had changed forever. He drove to the store, where what remained, charred remnants, was a cruel testimony to the destruction Gauthier had caused in his desperate attempt to cover his crimes. Pierre sat in the car for a few minutes, his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, staring at the remains of what had once been the symbol of his dreams realized. He took a deep breath, but the air seemed heavy, as if the atmosphere around him was impregnated with the smell of loss. Finally, he got out of the car and walked toward what had once been a luxury showroom. The floor was still covered in soot, and the remains of the sports cars, reduced to twisted metal carcasses, filled the space. Pierre walked slowly, each step accompanied by the muffled sound of his shoes on the ashes. The silence around him was deafening, only interrupted by the occasional crackling of still cooling metal. He stopped at the center of the showroom and looked around. His eyes began to burn, not just from the smell of burning, but because tears began to fall from his face as he knelt, his trembling hands touching the dirty ground. Pierre was a strong man, but the devastation was overwhelming. Everything he had built with such effort, every car he had bought and sold, every satisfied customer he had helped, every detail he had carefully overseen, was gone in a matter of hours. Pierre cried, and he wasn't ashamed of it. He cried for the store, for the years of hard work, for the sleepless nights spent planning, for the time lost in prison, and above all, for the betrayal he could never have predicted. Gauthier hadn't just destroyed his store. He had tried to destroy his soul, and for a moment, Pierre felt that maybe he had succeeded. But as his tears fell, something began to change within him. Amid the pain and devastation, a thought began to emerge. He wasn't just a man of loss. He was the one who had started with almost nothing and built an empire. He was the man who refused to accept the limits the world imposed on him. And at that moment, even kneeling in the ashes, he decided that he would not be defeated. Pierre stood up slowly, his eyes now firm and determined. He looked around, no longer with despair but with a careful assessment. The store was destroyed, but he was still there. And as long as he was alive, there was a chance to start again. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the road would be tough, but Pierre was driven by a strength that no betrayal or fire could extinguish, his will to succeed. With one last glance at the destroyed space, Pierre left the store. He knew he would need help to rebuild his business, but he also knew there were many people who believed in him, friends, clients, and even those who had followed his story from afar, knowing the man he was. He wasn't alone, and that gave him hope. Before getting into the car, he made a silent vow. He swore that within a year, this store would be standing again, even grander than before. He would not let Gauthier's actions define his future. The ashes around him weren't an end. They were a new beginning. The first thing Pierre did was gather the few allies he still trusted, some former friends, some entrepreneurs, others who had been clients and had followed his journey. They offered to help. They knew Pierre was more than the scandal that had been fabricated against him. He was an example of resilience, someone who turned dreams into reality, and now, more than ever, he needed this support network. An impromptu meeting was held at a small cafe in the center of Lyon. There, Pierre, still marked by the intensity of the past few weeks, presented his plan. He didn't just want to rebuild his store. He wanted it to be bigger, more modern, a symbol of his victory over adversity. "I'm not going to give up," Pierre declared firmly. "Gauthier tried to destroy me, but he doesn't understand one thing. Everything I've built comes from my will to push past the limits. It's not the ashes that will stop me." Pierre's words resonated with those present. They saw in him the same strength that had transformed a popular car dealership into a luxury empire. One by one, they began to pledge their support. A local entrepreneur offered a donation of 250,000 euros. Another construction company owner promised to help with the rebuilding costs. Others offered their connections to recover the lost stock of sports cars. In just a few hours, Pierre had raised over 750,000 euros in promises of support. But money wasn't everything. Pierre knew he had to regain the public's trust, especially after the scandal that had tarnished his reputation. He began working on a campaign to show he was back, more determined than ever. Using social media, he recorded a simple but powerful video, standing in front of the ruins of his old store, with the ashes still visible in the background. He looked directly into the camera and said, "This place may have been destroyed, but what it represents is alive in me. I am Pierre, and I am here to prove." The evidence began to be presented. Security camera recordings were shown on a giant screen for everyone to see. The footage of Gauthier sneaking into Pierre's office, searching through documents and then falsifying them, was irrefutable. Every second of these videos seemed to crush Gauthier's spirit more and more. He didn't look at the screen, preferring to stare at the floor, but the silence in the room spoke volumes. There was no doubt about his guilt. In addition to the recordings, experts confirmed that the document modifications were recent and exactly matched the dates when Gauthier had been filmed entering the office. The safe, to which only Pierre and Gauthier had access, contained enough evidence to seal his fate. The prosecutor's speech was clear, direct, and powerful. Gauthier had planned everything coldly, motivated by envy and resentment. When it was time for the defense, Gauthier's lawyer tried to justify his actions as a moment of weakness, an impulsive decision caused by years of accumulated frustration. He claimed that Gauthier felt undervalued and believed he deserved more than he was getting. But these words fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Then it was Pierre's turn to speak. He stood up, walked to the center of the room, and stared at Gauthier for a few seconds before turning to the court. "For years, I trusted this man. He wasn't just my manager. He was someone I believed in, someone I treated as a partner. I never thought he could turn against me like this, use my trust to try to destroy me. I've lost my freedom, my reputation, my livelihood, all because he decided that what I built with my own hands should belong to him. But today, I am here to say that he has failed. I am standing, and I will rebuild my life, my business, and my dignity." Pierre's voice resonated in the room, filled with emotion and firmness. It was a speech that not only reaffirmed his innocence but also showed his strength. When he finished, he returned to his seat, head held high as murmurs of approval were heard throughout the courtroom. When the moment for the verdict arrived, everyone held their breath. The judge, in a deep and impartial voice, read the conclusions. Gauthier was found guilty of all charges: fraud, document falsification, obstruction of justice, and arson. The evidence was clear, the intentions were deliberate, and the damage caused was irreparable. The court sentenced Gauthier to 17 years in prison without the possibility of parole until he had served at least 2/3 of his sentence. The words fell like a sentence of iron on Gauthier. He lowered his head, his shoulders trembling slightly as the reality hit him hard. His attempt to destroy Pierre had backfired devastatingly. He would now be remembered not as the man who tried to rise, but as the man who fell under the weight of his own greed. On the other side of the room, Pierre let out a long sigh. It wasn't exactly joy he felt, but a sense of justice finally achieved. He knew there was still much to do to rebuild his life, but this moment marked a turning point, the end of a dark chapter. He looked at Serge and nodded as if to say, "Let's move forward." As Gauthier was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed and defeated, Pierre stood up and walked out the main door, feeling the sun on his face for the first time in a long while. Outside, life went on, and he was ready to reclaim it, brick by brick, inch by inch, with the same determination he had always had. Pierre left the courthouse as a free man, but the weight of his newfound freedom was almost unbearable. Every step he took seemed heavy with the memory of the months of injustice, the betrayal by Gauthier, and the hell he had endured. Outside, the streets of Lyon looked the same as before, but for Pierre, the world he once knew had changed forever. He drove to the store, where what remained was a cruel reminder of the destruction Gauthier had caused in his desperate attempt to cover up his crimes. Pierre sat in the car for a few minutes, his hands tightly gripping the wheel, staring at the remnants of what had once been the symbol of his realized dreams. He took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy, as if the atmosphere around him was soaked with the smell of loss. Finally, he got out of the car and walked towards what had once been a luxury showroom. The floor was still covered in soot, and the remains of the sports cars had been reduced to twisted metal carcasses filling the space. Pierre walked slowly, each step accompanied by the muffled sound of his shoes on the ashes. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of still-cooling metal. He stopped at the center of the showroom and looked around. His eyes began to burn, not just because of the smell of burning, but because tears started to fall as he knelt, trembling hands touching the dirty floor. Pierre was a strong man, but the devastation was overwhelming. Everything he had built with so much effort, every car he had bought and sold, every satisfied customer he had helped, every detail he had carefully supervised, was gone in a matter of hours. Pierre cried, and he wasn't ashamed of it. He cried for the store, for the years of hard work, for the sleepless nights spent planning, for the lost time in prison, and above all, for the betrayal he could never have foreseen. Gauthier hadn't just destroyed his store, he had tried to destroy his soul. And for a moment, Pierre felt that he might have succeeded. But as his tears fell, something began to change in him. Between the pain and devastation, a thought began to emerge. He wasn't just a man of loss. He was the one who had started with almost nothing and built an empire. He was the man who had refused to accept the limits the world imposed on him. And in that moment, even kneeling in the ashes, he decided that he would not be defeated. Pierre slowly stood up, his eyes now firm and determined. He looked around, no longer with despair, but with careful assessment. The store was destroyed, but he was still there, and as long as he was alive, there would be a chance to start over. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead would be tough, but Pierre was driven by a strength that no betrayal or fire could extinguish. His will to succeed was unbreakable. With one last glance at the destroyed space, Pierre left the store. He knew he would need help to rebuild his business, but he also knew there were many people who believed in him, friends, clients, and even those who had followed his story from afar and knew the kind of man he was. He was not alone, and that gave him hope. Before getting into the car, he made a silent vow. He swore that in less than a year this store would be back up and running, even grander than before. He would not let Gauthier's actions define his future. The ashes around him were not an end. They were a new beginning.